War forces nations to choose between what is right and what is necessary. In the darkest months of World War II, when the Pacific seemed poised to collapse under the weight of Japan's relentless advance, America faced a brutal truth. They were running out of men. The Philippines were crumbling, the Dutch East Indies were gone, the British were reeling, and intelligence officers brought forward a report that sent a shock through Washington. A Japanese strike force, nearly 20,000 strong, was preparing to land on a strategically vital island the U.S. could not afford to lose. Reinforcements were too far. Marine divisions were exhausted. Army regiments were pinned down, and the Pacific Fleet was stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. The island's defense consisted of a scattered handful of Marines, a damaged anti-aircraft battery, and terrain that favored the attackers. If the Japanese seized the island, they would gain an airfield perfectly positioned to choke American supply routes and isolate entire sectors of the Pacific theater. The Joint Chiefs convened in a meeting room thick with cigarette smoke, maps littered with red arrows of enemy movements, and the unspoken dread that they were out of options. It was here, in desperation, frustration, and the raw fear of losing the Pacific, that a proposal resurfaced, a proposal so unorthodox, so morally gray, that it had been shelved months earlier. The idea had come from a colonel whose career had been built on unconventional warfare. His argument was simple, almost brutal in its clarity. The prisons are full of strong, capable, dangerous men. Many have military experience. Many know violence better than we do. If we cannot spare Marines, then send men who have nothing left to lose. At first, they laughed. Then the reports arrived, enemy forces mobilizing faster than anticipated, U.S. casualties rising, defensive lines failing. No one laughed after that. An order, stamped top secret, was signed and sent out through channels so obscure that many officers wouldn't see it for decades. Wardens across federal prisons received coded instructions to assemble lists of inmates who fit specific criteria. Men with combat backgrounds, men with high physical capability, men with behavioral volatility, men who could follow orders if given purpose, or at least could follow the promise of freedom. 90 names were selected from across the country. 90 files marked candidate for special deployment. 90 men who would be erased from official records the moment they left their cells. They were told nothing in advance. Guards simply woke them in the middle of the night, shackled them, and escorted them into military trucks with no markings. The island chosen for their preparation was a speck of jungle and volcanic rock hidden deep within the Pacific, isolated from shipping routes, patrol lines, and even curiosity. No name appeared on the maps handed to the pilots. No entry in any registry marked its existence. It was a place used only when absolute secrecy was required. A place where men could be reshaped without the world ever knowing they had been broken first. The 90 convicts arrived under a sky thick with low clouds, the kind that concealed the horizon and blurred sea and sky into a single oppressive gray. The airfield consisted of a single strip cut ruthlessly from the jungle, surrounded by barracks built not for comfort but containment. The first impression was not of a military camp, but of a liminal space, somewhere between the world they had left and the one they had not yet earned the right to enter. Despite their lack of training, the men sensed immediately that they were not prisoners anymore,
yet not soldiers either. Their uniforms were plain, their equipment functional, but stripped of identity, their surroundings both disciplined and decaying. They had been removed from one system of control only to be plunged into another. But the structure that awaited them here was different. This was not the rigid discipline of a formal army. It was something more primal, more urgent.
The days unfolded with an unrelenting rhythm, marked not by schedules or commands, but by necessity. The 90 were thrown into environments designed to break assumptions. Dense jungles where insects swarmed like living mist, cliffs slick with salt spray, caves that breathed heat like the interior of a furnace. The island was both instructor and adversary, demanding adaptation from men who had survived prisons, streets, wars, and lives spent dancing on the edge of violence. Many of them had known hardship, but few had known this specific kind of hardship, the merging of military precision with the improvisational brutality of survival. The island did not care about criminal records or former ranks. It responded only to skill. Those who adapted earned respect from its unforgiving landscape. Those who faltered learned quickly that failure here left scars deeper than metal bars ever had. The transformation began almost immediately. The soft edges of prison time, the lethargy, the routines, the artificial quiet fell away under the pressure of exhaustion. Muscles hardened, reflexes sharpened, instincts resurfaced. Men who had once been dragged through courtrooms with chains clattering at their ankles now ran through the jungle with an ease that surprised even themselves. The forest, thick with humidity and the scent of life and rot, became their proving ground. There was no spoken motivation, no encouragement, no praise. The island offered only tasks and consequences. They learned to move without sound, to sense threats before seeing them, to build traps from branches and stones, to read the wind as if it carried messages. Some possessed natural aptitude, former hunters, former soldiers, former men who had made their living in the shadows of city alleys. Others grew into their roles slowly, discovering abilities long buried under anger, addiction, or despair. In the evenings, as the sun collapsed into the sea and the jungle hummed with nocturnal life, the men sat in silence on the hard earth. The absence of speech became a defining feature of their existence. They did not need words. Their shared exhaustion forged its own language. Bonds formed not through trust, but through shared trials. Men who had once stolen, fought, or killed now learned to rely on each other for survival. The War Department had expected chaos, insubordination, perhaps even violence among the 90. Instead, something unexpected took shape. The men became a unit, not disciplined in the traditional sense, but bound by experience, pressure, and the unspoken knowledge that their survival depended on the person beside them. The island began to reshape them into something new. Their movements grew coordinated without instruction, their instincts aligned without discussion, their silence settled into purpose rather than defiance. By the third week, reconnaissance exercises that had once left them disoriented now unfolded with smooth precision. Night operations, once stumbling and chaotic, became their strength. The darkness felt familiar to men who had spent years beneath dim prison lights or navigating the hidden corners of cities. They thrived in it. Reports reached Washington describing the progress of the unit. The language was clinical, but between the lines was an undercurrent of astonishment. What had begun as a desperate experiment was evolving into something formidable.
The 90 were not merely surviving, they were becoming dangerous in a way that defied military classification.
Yet outside the island, time was slipping. The Japanese invasion force drew closer each day, its movements tracked by submarine patrols and scattered intelligence fragments. The scale of the approaching enemy was staggering. 20,000 men, hardened by victories across Southeast Asia and driven by an empire's ambition, advanced with the confidence of an unstoppable wave. Against them, the United States prepared to unleash 90 ghosts shaped by desperation. The island sensed the tension, as if the jungle itself held its breath. Storms rolled across the horizon more frequently, wind tearing through the trees with restless urgency. At night, the sea crashed against the cliffs with the force of a beating heart. The convicts felt it too, an approaching reckoning. Their training took on a sharpness that did not require explanation. They knew their time on the island was ending. The horizon was narrowing. The ocean that ringed their temporary sanctuary would soon carry them into a storm of steel and fire. They had been reshaped, forged in secrecy, stripped of identity and rebuilt in the image of necessity. They were no longer merely 90 prisoners. They had become a quiet force, prepared for a task that sane strategists would have declared impossible. And far beyond the waves that encircled their forgotten island, an army waited, vast, disciplined, and unaware that its advance would soon collide with something it could neither predict nor comprehend. Something born of war's most desperate gamble. The departure came without ceremony. At dawn, when the sky was still bruised with the last traces of night, the 90 were assembled and marched toward 2 waiting transports, old, weather-beaten aircraft that looked more suited for cargo than men. The island's training grounds, the barracks, even the jungle that had shaped them felt suddenly distant, as if they belonged to another lifetime. What remained was the quiet knowledge that whatever they had become would be tested soon and brutally. As the planes lifted into the air, the island shrank beneath them, swallowed by clouds. The 90 sat in rigid rows, each man subdued by a shared understanding that words no longer served a purpose. Their faces, hardened by weeks of relentless conditioning, revealed little emotion. Some stared forward, eyes fixed on nothing. Others closed their lids, sinking into a calm born not of peace, but of acceptance. They had been remade for violence, for secrecy, for tasks that had no place in official histories. Hours passed in a suspended silence, broken only by the drone of engines and the shifting weight of bodies adjusting on metal benches. The Pacific stretched below, endless, indifferent, vast enough to swallow armies without a trace. The 90 understood that once they were deployed, they would exist only as shadows between trees, their actions recorded nowhere except the memories of the men who survived beside them. The destination revealed itself as a patch of green amid a sea of blue, the endangered island whose fate had prompted their creation. Smoke rose lazily from its inland ridges, remnants of earlier bombardments. Even from above, the land looked tense, bracing for the impact of the Japanese force advancing across the ocean.
It was clear that any defense mounted so far had been little more than a delaying gesture.
The landing was swift and unadorned. Marines stationed there looked on with curiosity, but did not approach, recognizing the unmistakable aura of men who were not to be questioned. Supplies were handed off, brief instructions exchanged, and then the 9-0 vanished into the jungle with the ease of predators returning to familiar ground. Their boots left impressions on wet soil, but their presence dissolved into the terrain almost at once. Night fell quickly over the island, thick and impenetrable. From the high ridge where they positioned themselves, the 9-0 could see faint glimmers on the horizon, distant, rhythmic, and unmistakable. The Japanese fleet was closing in. The sea itself seemed to pulse with the approaching threat. And the 9-0, hidden within the jungle's breathing darkness, knew that everything they had endured was nothing more than a prelude to the storm now rolling toward them.
The 90 moved like ghosts through the dense jungle, machetes in hand, cutting narrow paths where none existed before. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves was a signal. Friend, foe, were the unseen eyes of a Japanese patrol. They carried only what they could, each man a self-contained unit of destruction. Grenades, knives, Thompson submachine guns, and the unspoken certainty that hesitation meant death. By nightfall, they had positioned themselves on a ridge overlooking a small strategic Japanese encampment. Lanterns flickered among tents, illuminating the rigid shapes of soldiers unaware of the storm about to strike. The 90 had been trained to strike with precision. No barrages, no warning, just the calculated chaos that left the enemy disoriented, terrified, and alone. Each man recalled the training: silence first, terror second, survival third. Communication was minimal: a single whistle, a hand signal, a tap on a tree, enough to coordinate a dozen simultaneous movements without the enemy ever knowing they were under attack. Their criminal records, their past lives, even their names mattered less than the mission: delay the Japanese advance at all costs. Survival was no longer personal. It was strategic, tactical, and above all, invisible.
The first attack came suddenly. A pair of men dropped silently into the camp, knives flashing under the moonlight. Shouts erupted, shots rang out, and the Japanese scrambled, disoriented by the precision and unpredictability of their attackers. From the ridge, the remaining men watched, ready to descend in waves, calculating the exact moment to strike again. Fear rippled through the camp, amplified by darkness, amplified by the unknown. Hours passed. When dawn broke, the Japanese ranks were in chaos. The 90 had vanished into the jungle as if the night itself had swallowed them. Their work had been surgical, their intent clear: disrupt, disorient, and survive. Reports from Allied observers later described the battlefield as a phantom assault, with no conventional unit claiming responsibility. Only the footprints in the mud hinted at the truth. Exhausted but unbroken, the 90 regrouped at the ridge. Bloodied hands, bruised shoulders, and eyes still sharp for movement, their faces showed no relief, only readiness. The battle had only begun, and the Japanese forces would soon realize they were being hunted, not engaged, by men society had discarded. In that jungle, the 90 had become something new, the embodiment of relentless, invisible war.
The Japanese regrouped at dawn, their discipline returning, their confidence growing, until they realized their perimeter had been breached and no conventional force had done it. Rumors spread among the ranks, ghosts in the jungle, shadows that struck without warning, and men who seemed immune to death. The 90 had no uniform, no insignia, no origin. They were an unknown variable in a war measured by strategy and numbers. They moved with precision. Patrols that wandered too far from camp vanished without a trace, leaving only the chaos of overturned gear and the faintest echoes of gunfire. The 90 worked in small cells, each man a living weapon, blending into the foliage, vanishing into smoke, leaving the enemy to chase phantoms. The Japanese could not counter what they could not see, and fear crept like a slow poison through their ranks. By the third day, intelligence reports noted that Japanese communications were disrupted. Couriers went missing, radios were destroyed. The enemy command began to doubt every report. The 90 knew these victories were small but critical. A patrol eliminated here, a supply line cut there. Each act of sabotage compounded the legend they were building, not for medals, not for recognition, but for survival and for the mission.
The jungle itself became an ally. Thick vines and sudden ravines provided cover and traps, and the men learned to use the terrain like an extension of their own bodies. Every hilltop, every river bend, every clearing became a stage for ambush. To the Japanese, it was warfare without warning. To the 90, it was a rhythm, a deadly dance choreographed by instinct and training. As night fell on the fourth day, a distant flare signaled another supply convoy approaching the ridge. The 90 prepared, checking weapons, tightening grips, and moving into position. They did not speak, they only acted. The attack would be swift, and when it was over, the Japanese would once again find themselves beaten not by a conventional army, but by a shadow that could strike anywhere. By dawn, the convoy lay in ruin, torched and scattered. Survivors fled into the jungle, leaving weapons and supplies behind. The 90 were gone before the first cries reached Allied ears. Another legend was born that night. A unit of men society had cast aside, capable of shaping battles not by numbers, but by cunning, terror, and ruthless efficiency.
Reports reached the Allied command that Japanese forces were massing in numbers far greater than anticipated. 20,000 strong, advancing through the jungle like an unstoppable wave. Conventional troops would have been crushed, their ranks decimated under sheer force. But the 90, they had become a storm of their own, shadows moving through the green, striking before the enemy could even see them coming. The first clash began at a river crossing, a narrow choke point where the enemy had no room to maneuver. The 90 had prepared traps, improvised explosives, and hidden machine gun nests. When the Japanese columns arrived, they walked into a perfect storm. Trees exploded, rifles barked from hidden positions, and the river ran red with the confusion and chaos the 90 had sown. It was not brute force, it was precision, patience, and fear as a weapon. Hours stretched into an unbroken haze of gunfire, smoke, and screams. Every man of the 90 fought like 10, striking, retreating, and striking again. The jungle seemed to bend to their will. They knew every hiding spot, every natural barrier, every weakness in the enemy's formation. The Japanese, for all their training and discipline, could not anticipate an enemy who refused the rules of conventional battle.
By nightfall, the river was littered with bodies, equipment abandoned, and the survivors scattered in terror. Allied reconnaissance could barely believe the reports. A mere 90 men had stalled and inflicted serious damage on an army 22,000 times their size. To the Allied command, it was almost myth. To the 90, it was another day in the shadow of war. In the aftermath, they regrouped silently, moving deeper into the jungle where the next confrontation awaited. They scavenged weapons from the battlefield, treated their wounded with makeshift ingenuity, and maintained the illusion of a force far larger than themselves. Every act, every ambush, every vanished patrol fed the legend that would echo beyond the war. By the 5th day, the Japanese began to call them the ghosts of the jungle. Commanders whispered of men who were everywhere and nowhere, striking with deadly efficiency and disappearing without a trace. Fear, it turned out, was more powerful than numbers, and 90 men, forgotten by society, had become the living proof. By the time the survivors emerged from the jungle, their story had already traveled faster than any official report could keep up with. Newspapers didn't yet know the full tale. The military files were buried deep under bureaucracy. But among the officers who witnessed the impossible feats firsthand, whispers began of men who defied the very limits of training and human endurance. The 90 were no longer prisoners. They were warriors forged in fire, tested against overwhelming odds, and found exceptional. Their tactics, hit-and-run assaults, camouflage, booby traps, and psychological warfare would later become the blueprint for elite commando units. Every lesson they learned in the jungle became a lesson the military would codify, a manual for survival in unconventional warfare. Despite their criminal records, their courage demanded recognition. Orders came down to document their exploits meticulously. Interviews were conducted, maps sketched, and maneuvers replayed in training exercises. The military began to see a startling truth. Bravery and skill could exist outside the normal mold of recruitment, and sometimes the unlikeliest candidates made the best soldiers.
Back in the United States, families of the 90 received only vague letters, sanitized to avoid alarming the public. Few would ever understand the reality of what their sons, brothers, or fathers had survived, and the 90 themselves remained quiet, bound by duty, secrecy, and the camaraderie that only men who faced death together could share. By 1944, the principles they had pioneered were being tested on other fronts. Special teams were being trained to emulate the jungle tactics, the ambushes, the guerrilla maneuvers that had allowed so few to confront so many. The seeds of what would become the Navy SEALs were quietly planted, nurtured by the shadowy legend of 90 men who had stared down 20,000 and lived to tell the tale. The world outside would never fully grasp the scale of what they had done. To most, it was a footnote, a curiosity, a strange chapter in a vast global conflict. But in military circles, in whispered strategy meetings, the story of the 90 convicts, soldiers, heroes, ghosts, was already shaping the future of modern warfare. They had not just fought, they had rewritten the rules of combat itself.
The survivors returned quietly, stepping off transport planes into a nation still at war, yet unaware of the true story they carried. No parades, no medals displayed on television, just a muted acknowledgement and the steady hum of bureaucracy sorting reports and files. To the public, they were simply soldiers among many, but those who had witnessed their deeds knew differently. Each man carried more than physical scars. They bore memories of fire, of comrades lost in impossible numbers,
of nights where the jungle itself seemed alive, testing every nerve. They spoke little, not out of shame, but because the world could not comprehend the magnitude of what they had endured. Their silence became their shield, a quiet defiance that the war had forged in them. The military, however, did not forget. Commanders recognized the value of unconventional thinking and raw courage that conventional recruits rarely displayed. Reports were written, training programs revised, and secret directives issued. The principles these men had lived in the jungles, adaptability, stealth, teamwork under extreme stress, were the blueprint for the elite forces that would follow. Yet the convicts themselves struggled to reintegrate. Civilians could not understand the bond between men who had faced 20,000 enemies with only 90 to stand against them. They returned to families, jobs, and streets that felt foreign, weighed down by the knowledge that their actions were extraordinary but invisible. Some disappeared quietly into anonymity, while others carried the legend like a burden, always aware that history might never truly credit them.
Over time, whispers of their heroism grew in military circles, and young officers studied their maps and battle reports with awe. In classrooms and training camps, instructors referenced to the tactics, often leaving out names, leaving out the prisoners' pasts, but capturing the essence of their daring. Their story became a silent cornerstone of what would evolve into the modern special operations doctrine. Even decades later, the legend endured. Official files remained classified, but veterans shared fragments, stories passed down in quiet corridors and mess halls. 90 men had faced a force that outnumbered them by hundreds, and against all odds, they survived, triumphed, and reshaped the art of warfare. They returned to shadows, but history, even if slowly, had begun to remember them. The war ended, but its echoes lived on in the training grounds of the Navy. Every new recruit in special operations studied scenarios eerily similar to the jungle campaigns of the '90s. The lessons of courage, improvisation, and ruthlessness were embedded in every manual, every drill, every whispered lesson from veteran instructors. Some of the '90s eventually joined advisory roles, shaping new units, teaching soldiers what could not be learned from books. Their criminal pasts were irrelevant. The skills they had honed under fire made them invaluable. In the quiet of remote training islands, they taught men to survive in environments where death was not a threat, but a certainty if they failed.
Their story influenced not just tactics, but philosophy. Leaders began to understand that valor and ingenuity were not confined to traditional soldiers, that desperation could forge brilliance. The brutal truth of their campaign, small numbers against overwhelming odds, became a template for asymmetric warfare that would echo through conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. Despite their contributions, public recognition remained limited. Histories of the war mentioned heroic battles and decisive victories, but rarely the tiny band of men whose courage had shifted the tide in microcosms of combat. Yet within the military, the legacy was etched indelibly, whispered to every generation that followed, shaping warriors long after the jungle had returned to silence. In quiet moments, some of the original 90 reflected on what they had done. They had been criminals, soldiers, and then legends. Their victories were not measured in medals or accolades, but in the survival of men under impossible circumstances and the lives saved by the doctrines they inspired. The legend of the 90 convicts endured, not as a footnote in history,
but as a cornerstone of elite warfare. They had faced the unimaginable, survived, and left a legacy of courage and ingenuity that would define the Navy SEALs and Special Operations Forces for generations. In the annals of war, they were ghosts, but their imprint on combat would never fade.
Decades later, historians and military analysts pieced together fragments of the Jungle Campaign. Declassified documents revealed the staggering odds, the sheer audacity of 90 men striking against 20,000. Scholars marveled at the improvisation, the tactics, and the endurance. They called it a precursor to modern special operations, a living proof that audacity and adaptability could overcome overwhelming force. The men themselves, now old, rarely sought attention. Interviews were few, and public acknowledgement came slowly, but when it arrived, it was reverent. Veterans' halls displayed photographs, maps, and faded letters. Young recruits listened in awe, understanding that their forebears had walked a line between death and legend. The jungle, long reclaimed by nature, held its secrets. Every hidden path, every ambush site, every improvised trap told a story. The men's courage was immortalized, not in grand monuments, but in the doctrines, drills, and DNA of the units they inspired. They had fought invisibly, yet their lessons shaped the visible battles of the future. In memoirs, documentaries, and military studies, the narrative became clear. Extraordinary courage can arise from extraordinary circumstances. 90 convicts had not just survived, they had transcended their pasts, proving that the measure of a soldier was not where he came from, but what he could achieve when pushed to the edge. By the time the world fully appreciated their feats, the Navy SEALs and Special Forces were already operating on the principles those 90 had forged. The techniques of small-team combat, silent infiltration, and psychological dominance traced directly back to their campaign. Their shadow had become light, guiding generations of warriors through conflicts no one could predict. And in the quiet corners of history, the truth remained. 90 men, taken from prisons, had stared down 20,000, and in doing so, they had rewritten the rules of war forever. Their names might have faded, but their legacy endured, unyielding, immortal, and as formidable as the jungle itself.